Catholic.
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to the Tuesday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN Radio. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you've got a question about the Catholic faith, trying to figure out that question, it's just bugging you, it's bothering you, and we would love to get an answer for it. We can give you the answer, and I guarantee it'll be the church approved answer. That's how we work. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the number 1 and then 205-271-2985. And of course, you can always send us an email. We'll get to one of those in a moment. The address for that, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer. Matt Gabinski is our phone screener. Jeff Burson handles social media for us. If you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook Live, we are streaming there right now. Just ask your question in the comments box, and then Jeff will see that. He'll shoot it to us here in the studio. Love to get your question answered on today's program. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Doing very well. How are you, sir?
I'm doing decent. Thank you very much.
We got a call in the overnight hours via the EWTN listener comment line.
Hi, my name is Parker, calling from San Antonio. I just had a question. I'm Eastern Orthodox, but living in this country, there's no Eastern Orthodox radio station, so I always tune into y'all's show, and I was just wondering the Catholic perspective of the Eastern Orthodox Church.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So the Catholic view on Eastern Orthodoxy is that we feel very close to you guys and believe that the Orthodox have valid sacraments and valid bishops and valid priests and valid apostolic succession. And although East and West have different theological traditions and liturgical traditions, they really hail from the same source and origin. And really the only major dividing point from our point of view is the question of the jurisdiction of the Pope. And for a Catholic, the Pope has universal jurisdiction over the Church, and Orthodox theologians generally reject that claim and see the Pope as the Bishop of Rome and the first among equals and the Patriarch of the West, but not the universal Vicar of Christ. So that's really the major dividing point. There are other issues that sometimes come up for discussion between Orthodox and Catholics that, to my way of looking at it, really obscure the fact that Catholicism is not just Latin. The Catholic Church is the Latin Church and 22 Eastern Rite Catholic communions that share liturgy and theological patrimony with the Orthodox. So we really don't have a problem with almost anything that the Orthodox do or think or believe, really except this issue of the Pope. That's really the major dividing point.
Very good. And thanks for your call to the listener comment line. Do appreciate that. Here's an email that we received from John in Portland, Oregon. 2 questions from John. Number 1, what is the actual role or responsibility of a godparent in the context of the Catholic faith? Also, if the grandmother and the mother of a child decide to do a do-it-yourself First Eucharist instead of enrolling in a program at their local parish church, would it be valid? This is kind of eating me up inside. I don't know what, if anything, I should do or say to the family. Thanks for your time, John in Portland.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate the question. So the role of a godparent is to be a Catholic presence in the life of that child and to pray for that child and to do what you can, given time and circumstances and distance, to advance that child in the development of their Catholic faith. When you talk about a mom and a grandmom doing a do-it-yourself Eucharist, I don't know if you mean that they have taken upon themselves to prepare the child for their First Holy Communion by way of catechetical instruction, or if the mom and the grandmom believe that they will consecrate the Eucharist. And it's ambiguous the way you've asked the question.
Don't know.
Both of them are problematic. One is more problematic than the other. All right. So it is the task and the authority and the responsibility of the parish priest to admit souls to Holy Communion. All right, so he has to set the criteria for what do you have to do to go to communion in this parish. And most parish priests will say that children preparing for a First Holy Communion need to go through either the church's own catechetical preparation or be enrolled in a Catholic school or some other criteria that the diocese or the parish has established. But you have to do that. You have to do what the priest or the bishop has said are the requirements for First Holy Communion in your jurisdiction. Now, if a mom and a grandmom decided they were going to educate the child at home and then bring the child to the church for Holy Communion, that would be okay if the priest said so. So if they check with priests and say, look, we want to educate, and this is the book we're going to use, and we're homeschooling or something, and this is how we're going to prepare the kid, is that okay? The priest says, okay, okay. Priest doesn't say okay, it's not okay, or not okay. Now, would that child's communion be valid? It would be illicit. It would be illegal. It would be against the law. But a baptized, believing person who is admitted to Holy Communion is really receiving the body and blood of Christ. And of course, the fault here is not the child's; it would be the parents. And so, the child's not going to incur any guilt. But that would be highly irregular, and it would be against the law of the church. You ought not to do it. If, on the other hand, the mom and grandmom think they're going to take care of the entire thing themselves, including presenting the child with communion, with some sort of home communion, well, that's just not communion because they're not priests, and so they can't consecrate the sacred species, and they cannot. There's no body of Christ there, and there's no communion there. It's just bread and wine at that point. You've got to have a priest for a validly consecrated Eucharist.
John, thanks so much for checking in from Portland. Here's something I learned, David. You may be interested in this. I learned this in the 3rd grade. Do you know the difference between unlawful and illegal?
I don't know. What's the difference?
Unlawful would be against the law, whereas illegal is a sick bird.
Oh, okay. All right, yeah.
There you go. If you would like to send us an email for a future show and hopefully keep me from doing more of these stupid 3rd grade jokes, do you want to send that to ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. It's amazing what comes out of the mouth when you've got 15 seconds to fill. Anyway, in a moment, we're going to get to Tony in Los Angeles. We've got some lines open for you right now on this edition of Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. 833-288-EWTN is our number, 833-288-3986. Call to Communion on this Tuesday afternoon here on EWTN.
Hi friends, Janet Williams here. Join me every Wednesday on Women of Grace Live as I welcome New Age researcher and blogger for Women of Grace, Sue Brinkman. Sue and I will be talking about all the wacky things that could distract you from your faith. Psychics, yoga, Reiki, crystals, acupuncture, Ouija boards, tarot cards, and astral traveling are just a few of the stranger things we discuss. That's why we call it Wacky Wednesday. So join us tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Father Benedict Groeschel.
Some great people have shown respect for God. Can I read you a little quotation from Albert Einstein, who many times showed a great respect for religion and was one of the great admirers of Pope Pius XII for his stand against the Holocaust during the Second World War. Einstein wrote, "The fairest thing we can experience is the mysterious. It's the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of all true art and science. A knowledge of the existence of something we can't penetrate, of the manifestations of the profoundest reason and the most radiant beauty, which are only accessible to our minds in their most elementary form. It is this knowledge and this emotion that constitute the truly religious attitude." Oh my. So beautifully said.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
Glad you could join us for the Tuesday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN Radio. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. We'll get to the phones in just a second here. Let me tell you about a new book available from EWTN Publishing, Simple Steps to a Stronger Marriage by Dr. Ray Guarendi. Dr. Ray explains the secret of a good marriage is applying a handful of common sense, time-tested ideas practiced by others who have already done it very well. With Dr. Ray's advice, you will learn some tips on how husbands can support their wives in parenting. Also, how living by the just don't say it philosophy is a real game changer. Check out this wonderful book, Simple Steps to a Stronger Marriage by Dr. Ray Guarente, now available from EWTN Publishing at EWTNRC.com. Buy Catholic, shop Catholic, EWTNRC.com. Let's go to Tony now to lead us off here, if you're ready. Tony's in Los Angeles watching us today on YouTube. Hey, Tony, what's on your mind today, sir?
Yeah, I thank you, Dr. Anders. Thank you for the show. I just wanted to say that, I love my church. I've been serving my church since my early 20s when I was in graduate school. And I understand the Orthodoxy. I've done enough research there to really believe in the Orthodoxy of the Catholic Church. But what's been mainly a stumbling block for me is just the Catholic indifference, especially at the parish level, specifically towards the Christians of the Middle East, genocide. And the most nauseating for me was the indifference shown towards canceling St. Junipero Serra. And being in California, the majority of the cities here, the major cities, are named after his mission. Mm-hmm. So even when canceling our history and basically removing us from the States, I, along with some friends from other Catholic groups, we reached out to some 52 parishes, Knights of Columbus State, my local council, other local councils, and just nothing. Complete indifference. And, I've had enough time to think about it that I honestly believe we have a cultural problem. So my question is Orthodoxy enough? And it doesn't seem like it to me. It seems like, the church in Ephesus was strong in Orthodoxy, but it was lacking in zeal. So how can we just sit around and act so indifferent when our civilization is being destroyed, history being canceled, Christian communities annihilated? I just don't understand that.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I really appreciate the question. So the quick answer, the short answer, is that, of course, orthodoxy is not enough. Being orthodox will not get you to heaven. Being transformed in charity and the virtues will get you to heaven. And orthodoxy, the content of the faith, is a means to an end. It's not the end in itself. So absolutely, it's not enough. Now, in terms of the specific complaints that you have with your local church in Los Angeles, one of them was the genocide of Christians in the Middle East, and we might also add other places in the world. My sense is that, I know what you're talking about. Most people in the West, and most Catholics too, are abysmally ignorant about this.
Yep.
And it gets absolutely no coverage whatsoever at all in the popular media. And whatever is salient in your imagination, what's been placed there, over and over again on the idiot box, is what typically rises to the top of people's consciousness. Is what people are talking about in the public sphere, in the political sphere, and that's typically what we get excited about. Just what's constantly repeated to us, and so we are up against a culture. This isn't necessarily the problem of Catholic culture. This is the problem of wider American culture. Highlighting the things that you're supposed to care about and ignoring the things that they don't want you to care about. But yeah, there is definitely a problem there. But I don't know that implicates Catholics particularly in some kind of pernicious evil, except that they live in a culture that's not encouraging them to think about the welfare of things like decimated Christian communities in the Middle East. I just personally find there's an extraordinary amount of ignorance about Middle Eastern Christianity. Most people today don't even realize that there are historic Christian communities in the Middle East. A book like Philip Jenkins' Lost Christianities is a magnificent corrective to that, emphasizing that the Middle East and even a place like Baghdad was the geographic and demographic heart of Christianity for about the first 1,000 years. And we so used to thinking about Christianity and Catholicism in particular as a Northern European or European and American and South American phenomena. We forget that it was born in Galilee and Jerusalem. And that's where it had its geographic center for so very long until the Muslim conquests. In terms of the other issues you raised, again, I think the political environment in the United States is just overwhelmingly important for understanding people's mindset, and you are a minority voice for an unpopular cause.
Yeah.
And again, that's just the challenge of living in today's world. Now, what can we do about it? Well, obviously, you seem to me to have the soul of an activist. And when you read the biographies of great activists throughout history, usually they all felt like they were fighting a losing battle against overwhelming odds. And that's why we lionize them and valorize them today. We look back on their causes and say, how was this person so far-sighted that they could see what nobody else was seeing? And usually they live through massive disappointment for decades if they ever see any fruit at all. And so, if that's your vocation, if you're an activist for these particular causes and you've met with initial disappointment, then I would say, well, welcome to the lot of many activists and many saints throughout centuries.
Tony, is that helpful for you in any way?
As always, yes, absolutely.
Appreciate your call. I remember when we lived in California back in the day, my wife had a aunt and uncle who lived probably a stone's throw from San Juan Capistrano. And we would visit there on occasion and sometimes go to Mass there. And her aunt and uncle were not Catholic, but they were glad to take us. And then so we went from there on to other missions, up and down the California coast. I can remember, Carmel and, Buenaventura and Santa Barbara. Just fascinating.
Neat.
Yeah,
what
absolutely.
Can I say?
That I miss, I must say. Tony, thanks again for your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Tuesday afternoon here on EWTN. Anna Marie, watching us on YouTube, says, why do we say in the Creed, we believe? Wasn't it at one time, I believe? How can I say something someone else believes? Well, I guess it depends on the creed, doesn't it?
Yeah, thank you. So the one we recite in Mass in the Latin typical is Credo in unum Deum, the credo being the first person singular. That is I.
Yes.
And so we is a mistranslation. And I think efforts have been made to correct that many places.
Let's hope so. Appreciate that, Anna Marie. Glad that you're watching us on YouTube. Calls are coming in right now at 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, maybe you'd like to explain to us what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic. Again, 833-288-3986. Julie has an interesting email here. Hi, Dr. Anders. Appreciate your show so much. I've recently begun listening more and more. Here's my question. How do I know what sins of mine are forgiven and which I have forgotten but need to confess? I ask because I, quote, fell away from the Catholic Church. I've come back, confessed some current sins, alluded to past sins. Do I need to make an appointment to have a thorough sit-down and go over all the sins during that sad period in my life? I feel like I do, but I also feel like I have been contrite in my heart for my past waywardness. I also don't want to keep going back and forth dwelling on past sins. Thanks for clarifying and illuminating answers for me. Sincerely, Julie.
All right, I got you taken care of, Julie. No problem. Here's what you need to do. I would recommend making an appointment with the priest. Go in and do what's called a general confession, and that is that you confess every known mortal sin, every mortal sin that you can think of or remember, and you make an effort to be comprehensive. Now, if there were some years you were out of the church without confession, it's highly likely that you've forgotten a lot of the specifics. So you do something like this. Let's say you had the habit of robbing banks. That'd be a mortal sin. And so you don't remember how many banks you robbed. Was it 100? Was it 150? You don't know. So you go in and say, Father, I used to rob a lot of banks. I robbed a bunch of them. Can't remember how many. Boom, you're done. That's it for the bank robbing.
Yeah.
You move on to the next thing. And you're not trying to conceal anything, but you just can't remember specifics. You just make a good faith effort to be as comprehensive as possible. You don't have to confess every sin you've committed, just every known mortal sin, the grave sins. And when you've done that, if you do it in good faith, you make a real effort, then everything that you have done, whether you remember it or not, is forgiven. And then from that moment on, you don't ever confess that stuff again. The next time you go to confession, you will only confess the things you have done since your previous confession.
Julie, thanks so much for your email. Appreciate hearing from you. Chike is watching us on YouTube today and says, Dr. Anders, I hear a lot of people say they are spiritual but not religious. They say this in opposition to our worship. So first of all, what do they mean? Secondly, How can I respond to them?
Yeah, thank you. So generally when people say they're spiritual but not religious, what they mean is that they are sensitive, or they understand themselves to be sensitive to a transcendent dimension in human life. They want to have something approximating spirituality, some sense of connection to the great beyond, some sense that there's an order in the universe to which they want to align their life.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't think that the rites and symbols of traditional religions are the way to do that. And so typically they're autodidacts in the religious sphere, meaning they cobble together for themselves some sort of homegrown spirituality from elements that they find lying around. And typically today, they could include anything from elements of meditation to smatterings of the New Age or the occult, maybe the alien abductions, you name it. They just find whatever they can that floats their boat, pull that together and call that a spirituality. And the way to respond to that is that, well, everybody, in a sense, is spiritual but not religious. I mean, that's the natural condition of the human person. We have a transcendent personality, a transcendent soul that naturally desires union with God and with transcendent meaning. All of us try to address that in whatever ways that we can, and whether or not we are successful in that will depend on the extent to which our attempts actually align with the actual spiritual needs of the human person. Now, the value in a religious tradition like Catholicism is that you've got the wisdom of 2,000 years of history behind you and a lot of false starts and bad mistakes that people have made over the centuries in the spiritual domain. And look, it's easy to make bad starts and false starts and bad decisions have been accounted for and corrected. And we have a guide in the form of a wisdom tradition to help us discern what kind of priorities do I need to have in my spiritual quest. Let me give you an example. So if you read the mystics of the Catholic tradition, one of the things they will identify is the false temptation of the woo-woo experience. And we all know what the woo-woo experience is. That's the hair standing up on your arms and the swoozy stomach and the sense that, I'm having some kind of powerful experience of emotion and I feel one with the universe and the sky is beautiful and the music sounds great and the food tastes wonderful. And to make to make that the focus of your religious quest, most religious traditions that have been around for a few centuries recognize that kind of phenomenological experience is fleeting and hollow. And what you're aiming for is a transformation of character that is evidenced in the life of virtue. And if you don't have a tradition there that can remind you of these truths, it just becomes way too easy to get wrapped up in the woo-woo or into superstition. And so religion as an institution is there to be a guide to the religious, to the spiritual life, to help us meet those aspirations, those transcendent longings, but while avoiding the errors of superstition and false starts.
Thank God is there for us. Chike, thanks so much for checking us out on YouTube today. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go now to Tim, a first-time caller from Lebanon, Ohio, listening on the great Sacred Heart Radio, AM 910. Hey there, Tim. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hello there, Dr. Anders. I'm a big fan. My son is in college, just came home, sophomore in college, and so he took me aside after a couple of days, and he said, "Dad," he said, the college life is not really good for his view of women." And he said, "Can you help me to?" He said, "Dad, I want a starter kit for respecting women." He said, "I don't think I look at the way I look at women is a good ordered way of doing that." So I thought, well, maybe I'll give you a call and see if you had some things you can read or things you could watch or some ideas.
Wow.
Yeah, several documents come to my mind right off the bat. Obviously, John Paul II's encyclical Mulieris Dignitatem on the dignity of women would be one. Erica Bacciocchi's book, Women, Sex, and the Church would be another one. And anything you can get your hands on by Dietrich von Hildebrand and his wife Alice von Hildebrand. They write lots about Christian marriage, sexuality, the dignity of women and men. Dietrich von Hildebrand did a doctoral work, actually, in his studies on the doctrine of purity. I mean, so all kinds of good material there.
Wow, that is a very enlightened viewpoint for Tim's son to actually come to his dad and say, I need some help here because I feel I've got a disordered view of women.
Absolutely. Another good resource would be John Paul II's Theology of the Body and lay distillations of that doctrine.
Tim, is that helpful for you?
Yeah. Any saints that he may pray to, or saints' lives that he may look to?
Sure. So St. Thomas Aquinas is often viewed as the patron of men seeking purity. He is the patron of the Angelic Warfare Confraternity, which is another organization you might want to look into. According to legend, Thomas himself was granted the gift of perfect continence, that he never had any temptations against purity after a particular experience in his life, and that's why he is the patron. So he'd be the one to go to.
Certainly St. Augustine had his issues with women.
He did. You know,
he did.
He did.
So you might want to check out the confessions there. Tim, thanks so much for your call. In a moment, we'll get to Matt in the wonderful city of Fargo. We'll also talk with Gina in, looks like Lincoln, Nebraska. And we've got some lines open for you as well at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Stay with us.
Want to be notified when Called to Communion goes live on Facebook? Follow EWTN Radio's Facebook page and click the bell icon to be notified.
The most original Catholic content is on EWTN Radio. Next time on EWTN Live, Bill Donahue challenges us to protect American virtues, freedoms, and work ethics from deteriorating further on the next EWTN Live.
EWTN Live with me, Father Mitch Patwell, Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern on EWTN TV and radio.
This is a Pro-Life Minute with doctors Stephen and Gracie Christie.
There's a callous argument we hear all the time that's very offensive. I'm curious how you handle this. That it's better to kill a child, to abort a child, than for that child to be born with a handicap or a deformity or to be stuck in a foster care system. How do we respond?
Well, acknowledge that what they're really saying is that it's better to eliminate the sufferer than eliminate the suffering. Instead of improving foster care and the adoption process, we should just kill the child? How did killing a child become an act of mercy?
And you know what group of people most disagree with this argument? People with disabilities and their parents. Those with disabilities don't like it when people tell them that their lives are not worth living. They don't like it when people tell them that ending their lives is the most compassionate thing someone can do for them. They and their parents would tell you that's the least compassionate act they could ever imagine.
For more on the culture of life, go to EWTN.com/prolife.
It's the month of Mary.
How did you honor the Blessed Mother this month?
We'd love to hear your stories tomorrow on Take Two with Jerry and Debbie on most of these EWTN stations.
And now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Hey, what's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about that here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Looks like we have 3 lines open right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Our congratulations going out to a longtime member of the EWTN radio family, Holy Family Radio in Louisville, celebrating their 24th year with us. How about that? Congratulations to Vince Heiser and his great team at WLCR, AM and FM in Louisville, from all your friends right here at EWTN Radio. All right, let's go back to the phones now at 833-288-EWTN. Matt is in Fargo, listening on the great Real Presence Radio. Hello, Matt. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hello. Thanks for taking my call. Big fan.
Thank you.
My question was, in the past, Dr. David Anders has given a wonderful historical context to some modern Protestant ideas about Christianity, kind of like having the personal relationship or the altar call, kind of going from Martin Luther to Billy Graham to Moody, and kind of getting to why some of the traditional Protestants use those terms and why they're modern. And I was wondering if he could kind of do that.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I appreciate the question. So Reformation, of course, is often dated from Luther's publication of the 95 Theses. They are a very early part of Luther's thought, and his thought developed a good bit after that. By 1520, he'd really arrived at the main theses that characterized the Lutheran position. And they basically were justification by faith alone and sola scriptura, the priesthood of all believers, the elimination of the Catholic priesthood, and rejection of the sacrifice of the Mass. But things that Luther retained that were Catholic convictions, Luther continued to believe till his dying day that baptism was regenerative, that the soul brought to baptism would truly be born again in Christ, and he believed in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Luther rejected a lot of Catholic doctrines, but he maintained those. And so in some respects, he would be seen as conservative in comparison to more radical forms of Protestant Christianity. Now, within Calvinism, John Calvin, who's a church leader in Geneva, who's French by birth, but he was a leader in Geneva, Switzerland from 1536 to his death in 1564 with a brief hiatus when he was in Strasbourg. Calvin added a few wrinkles to the Protestant theory, and one that was more or less radical was Calvin's belief that he believed, like Luther, that baptism really was an occasion for regeneration. Souls brought to baptism could genuinely be born again and enter into the spiritual life, regenerated by the Spirit of God. But Calvin thought that it wasn't guaranteed. Whereas Luther would have seen anybody brought for baptism as regenerate. That's the Catholic position. Calvin thought that, yes, a soul brought for baptism can be regenerate, but only if they are elect. Calvin's so-called doctrine of double predestination. And so there is a possibility in the Calvinist scheme of things that two souls could be brought for baptism. One would be regenerate and one not. And the second soul might, at some subsequent point, baptism might become effective in them. They might become regenerate later or never. And so it wasn't sufficient to discern just whether a person was baptized to determine whether they were born again. Now, this is really important in Calvin because, unlike the Catholic Church, Calvin thought that if a person was regenerate, was born again of the Spirit of God, that they would necessarily persevere to the end. So unlike Catholics, see, in the Catholic view, you can be baptized, you can be born again, you can have the Spirit of God, but you can walk away. You can fall away from grace and still be lost. For Calvin, if you've really got the Spirit of God, you're not going to fall away. You will necessarily persevere to the end. You can distinguish in the Calvinist scheme between what you might call real Christians, those who really have the Spirit of God in whom baptism was genuinely effective, and those who are just nominal, who are Christian in name only, and they may be participants in the public life of the church, but they really are not. They're really not heaven bound, and they're not elect. That distinction became very important in Puritanism, and you've heard of Puritanism. The Pilgrim Fathers that came to the United States were Puritans.
Yeah.
And so it became important for them to discern, am I one of those people in whom baptism was effective? Am I one of those people who's really born again? And they evolved a lot of different tests to discern within themselves the marks of election. Probably the most famous work in this genre of literature would be The Religious Affections by Jonathan Edwards. And this was, a book that was meant to spell out what are the sort of phenomenological qualities, interior qualities of a person who has that experience. And Puritans disagreed. They had all different kinds of theories. But eventually what emerged from that emphasis on introspection, on self-contemplation, as Newman would call it, was a diminishing of influence, of emphasis upon the external rites of religion, like the sacraments, like church organization or denominational difference, and a highlighting of the interior subjective change. And this really emerges during the First Great Awakening, particularly in the mind of George Whitefield, who's one of the great preachers of the First Great Awakening. And he's the first person I found who positively teaches that denominational difference makes no difference, that you can belong to whatever denomination you want, provided you have that interior change in your heart. Now, for Whitefield has no notion of pray to receive Jesus into your life. So the Billy Graham style of conversionistic appeal, come forward at the altar and invite Christ in your life, that wasn't Whitefield's way. What Whitefield would do is he would preach conversion, he would preach sin and redemption, and he would teach justification by faith, and some portion of the congregation would become overwhelmed and convicted, and they would cry out to God for mercy, and Whitefield and others like him would see that as signs of election. This means that person is genuinely born again. And a lot of fervor and emotional excitement came out of the First Great Awakening. Now, 100 years later, in the Second Great Awakening, associated with names like Charles Finney and Asa Mahan, they did not have Calvinistic theology. They didn't believe in double predestination. They didn't believe that the initiative for salvation came uniquely from God's side. They thought human agency could play a more important role. But what they adopted from the First Great Awakening was an emphasis on that condition of being emotionally overwrought and the idea that salvation could come on you in a moment. And what Finney's contribution to revivalism was the idea that you could manufacture these things. You could set up a set of conditions that could emotionally manipulate people into making a positive decision for Christ. Now, still, even in Finney's writing, you don't find the idea of inviting Jesus into your heart. It really is trying to coerce people into making a moral determination to follow Christ with the course of their lives. But he used things like the anxious bench and the altar call as props, as tools to manipulate the psychology to move a person into making this decision to follow Christ. Now, that became the model for the Second Great Awakening and for evangelists from that time on. How can we move a crowd to make a commitment to Jesus? Now, in the ministry of D.L. Moody, which comes at the tail end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, Moody would have these very large revival meetings with thousands of people, and he would enlist collaborators who would gather the congregants into little bands and exhort them to give their lives to Christ. And those guys, Moody's collaborators, felt like they needed some way to know that they had sealed the deal. Like, how do you know you've succeeded in this? And that's where, in Moody's revivals, is where the idea emerged that we will have a prayer that people can say. You can pray these words. This is the form that your commitment will take. And that is the origin of the sinner's prayer. And so you go from a Calvin who separates election and regeneration from baptism to the Puritan insistence that I need to find out if I'm really saved and what are the signs that I can have that experience, to Whitefield detaching that from any kind of sacramental or denominational context, to Charles Finney and Asa Mahan arguing that the whole transition could be mechanized and manipulated through the use of tools and instruments like the altar call. Finally, to Moody, who introduced the idea of the sinner's prayer. Pray this prayer and then you'll be saved. Now, that got picked up by guys like Billy Sunday, and then and Bill Bright, founder of Campus Crusade for Christ, which was a tremendously influential evangelistic organization that spread across college campuses throughout the world. And Bright published a little book called The Four Spiritual Laws, which the last time I checked, I think had been printed something like 1 billion times.
Really?
I mean, it is an unbelievably well-disseminated piece of literature. And if you read, I don't recommend it, but if you were to read The Four Spiritual Laws, there is literally a prayer, I think about 3/4 of the way in, that encourages the reader, here, pray this prayer and you'll be saved. Now, it's not quite that shallow, but that's the gist of it. That's the way it's often translated. Here, do this and you'll be saved. And through the Four Spiritual Laws and Bill Bright, the Campus Crusade, this idea of, pray the prayer, invite Jesus into your life and get to heaven, just became incredibly widely disseminated across the Protestant world, and now it's almost taken for granted. When I was growing up as a child, I grew up in the 1970s, and my family had stacks of the Four Spiritual Laws lying around. My mother used to leave them, on top of the pumps at gas stations and hand them out to waiters and stuff. And that counted as evangelism. Hand people the Four Spiritual Laws.
Okay.
And I just grew up thinking of this as like the second Bible. This was you know how to go to heaven, read the Four Spiritual Laws. And then, I read the Four Spiritual Laws, and I committed those verses to memory. And then someplace around college or seminary, I remember I began to think, as I started reading the Bible for myself, in context, reading the whole books, I realized that this morphology of conversion that had been presented to me in evangelicalism was nowhere represented in the text of the Bible. Like, you couldn't find the complete picture put together, the steps of conversion as I had come to understand them. I didn't find them in any discrete book of the Bible. Paul didn't advise this, Jesus didn't advise this. And I realized the only way that I could construct this formula of salvation was if I relied on something like Bill Bright and the Four Spiritual Laws. Bill Bright had said it clearly, but the Bible didn't. And that really got me suspicious right? And I began to realize, okay, now what they've done is they've pulled texts completely out of context and arranged them in a certain order to make the Bible say what they want it to say. And then when I began to study the history of the thing and see how this evangelical theology of conversion had emerged over centuries and the specific historical antecedents, I realized the whole thing was just, a modern innovation.
Fascinating. Matt, thanks so much for your call. It's called a communion here on EWTN. Well, back in the day, there was a movie, I think it was in the early 60s, all about, these big tours that went throughout Europe. And the movie was called If It's Tuesday, This Must Be Belgium. Remember you ever hearing about that?
No, I don't know that one.
Way back then. And so I'm thinking, well, if it's Tuesday, this must be Mother Angelica Live. And indeed, that's what we bring you every Tuesday evening on EWTN radio and television at 8 p.m. Eastern. Tonight, Mother lends her insight on the 7 gifts of Pentecost. Do check it out again tonight, 8 p.m. Eastern on EWTN radio and television. Let's go now to Rebecca in St. Petersburg, Florida. And Rebecca is listening on Ave Maria Radio. Rebecca, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Dr. David. So I have a question. Years ago, a priest told me that we should never speak about our confessions outside of the confessional. And he wasn't speaking about, like, me speaking to my confessor, right? He was talking about in general. And so I've always kind of thought that was a thing. And over the years, I've heard other people say that, too, like, we shouldn't speak about our confessions. And so recently, it just seemed reasonable to me. So recently, somebody asked me about this, and I really didn't have a good answer, other than I just, in my own thinking, I just thought that it could be a source of pride or that could be irreverent to the sacrament. So I was just wondering, is this a thing? I've tried to find, an answer to that in the catechism and haven't been able to find anything, but I was just wondering, is it wrong or irreverent for us to speak about our confessions outside of the confessional, like just in general?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So there is no law of the church that prevents you or forbids you to speak about your confession outside the confessional. There is a law that prevents the priest from speaking about it. He is bound by what's called the seal of the confession. And if he tells anybody what goes on in your confession, he is automatically excommunicated. I mean, it's big, big, bad stuff for the priest. But there's nothing preventing you from doing it. And I think at times it can be very helpful to others to hear about, particularly somebody that might be intimidated about the confessional or not understand how it works, to share an anecdote from the confessional and how it's helped you and the kind of things, the kind of preparation that you make could really help another soul. Now, you raised some specific concerns, like if I do this, am I perhaps going to be subject to the sin of pride? Well, that would be something for you to discern in your own life, and if your motive is pride, then don't do that, right? If you have some prurient motive, don't do that. But if your motive is edification and to build up the faithful, then yeah, absolutely do that. And here's an instance where I think you almost have to talk about what goes on in confessional. If you are abused in the confessional in any way, like horrifically, like through some sort of solicitation or sexual abuse, but even pastorally, if a priest is just very unkind and doesn't conduct himself in a way that's fitting for a Catholic priest, then that's something that should definitely be brought to that priest's superiors. And you're not in any way bound to hold that back. In fact, I think you really ought to go be a tattletale.
Yeah, there you go. Rebecca, thanks so much for your call. I can remember several occasions in my own family where my wife has been struggling with some sort of an issue, and I've actually said, I actually confessed that a couple of weeks ago, and here's some advice that I got out of it. So
now I will say this. This is just me personally.
Yeah.
I had a policy in my house. I still have this policy that I would never ask a family member what they said in the confessional.
No.
And I always wanted my kids in particular to know that whatever they said in the confessional was absolutely sacrosanct, because I didn't want them to ever be intimidated to go for fear that, I might have to tell Dad about this later.
Yeah.
I don't want them to have to tell Dad. I want them to tell the priest and do business, and then I'm out of the picture. So I never ask anybody about their confessions, ever, ever, ever. But I have told people about my confessions.
Sounds like a good plan to me. It's called Communion on this Tuesday afternoon here on EWTN. Glad that you're with us today. Freddie is watching us on YouTube today. Freddie says, what do indulgences do? The reason I ask what indulgences do is because I heard that if they don't get you to heaven, then what's the point?
Yeah, thanks. So let me talk a little bit about the history of indulgences and put them in context. That might be helpful to you.
Okay.
In the ancient church, when people would commit grievous public sin, scandalous sin, it was very common that they would be disciplined, and we read about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Paul describes the process for doing this. They'd be disciplined by being excluded from the sacraments, excluded from communion, and they would be forced to perform some public penance. And it could just be exclusion from the sacraments, and sometimes that could last a long time. Might last for months, might last, in some cases, if it was a particularly egregious sin, like, multiple murders or something, they might be out for years, even until the end of their life. And in fact, when you read the canons of the Council of Nicaea from the year 325, there's specific instructions in there about, hey, if somebody's doing penance and they're in danger of death, make sure you readmit them to Holy Communion. Like, danger of death throws everything else out the window.
Yeah.
Now, this really became a big issue in around the year 250, around the Decian persecution, the Roman Emperor Decius, who persecuted the church. There were a lot of Christians who had apostatized during the persecution. They'd given up their faith under threat of persecution. Then they had come back to the church and wanted to be readmitted. And so the question is, well, okay, we're going to readmit them, but on what basis? They've sinned by apostasy, so they need to do some kind of penance. And so they did, and many of them were admitted back in, but they were barred from communion initially. There were others in the persecution that had confessed the faith and been martyred, and some who had confessed the faith and been imprisoned. And so it was seen to be, well, this is not exactly just. What if we have these confessors that are running around? They paid the price, and we can't make the people apostatized in the same place as the ones that paid the price. What are we going to do about this? And the people who were doing penance would sometimes go to the prisons, and they would meet with the confessors who were languishing in prison, and they would say, you know what, the church favors you guys because y'all kept the faith, and here you are suffering meritoriously. I bet if you wrote out a writ of indulgence and you sent it to the bishop and said, please let my imprisonment count towards this guy's penance, that the bishop might listen to you and let me back into communion sooner. And this started to happen. And so confessors in prison were writing out writs of indulgence and asking the bishops, please let my suffering count towards this guy. And I mean, this is a kind of a biblical principle. You'll see this in Holy Scripture, where the righteousness of the few can avail for the sake of the many, like in Genesis 18, for example. And Cyprian of Carthage, the Bishop of Carthage in 250, got these letters, and he looked at them and he said, you know what, the theology's good. The idea that one Christian can suffer on behalf of another, that's good, that's biblical. But the ecclesiology is bad, because the jurisdiction over penance and absolution belongs with the bishop, not with the guy in prison. So here's what we're going to do. We will, and I want to emphasize that this idea came from the laity. It did not come from the clergy. Bishop says, all right, we'll do this. We'll let the merits of the saints and the martyrs and the confessors count for the penitent, but the distribution of these graces, the administration of this, has to belong to the bishop. And that was the origin of indulgences. Now, it wasn't long before people realized, well, if you can apply an indulgence for the temporal punishment due to sin in this life, can you not apply an indulgence for the temporal punishment due to sin in the next? And notice I used the word temporal, right? Not eternal punishment. Indulgences don't do anything about damnation. But for Catholics who believe in purgatory, that there is a place of cleansing and reparation after death that serves the same function that penance in this life does, then the logic of applying an indulgence to that temporal punishment, the merits of the saints availing on my behalf, is sound. And so that's the development of indulgences, and that's the logic behind them.
Okay. Hey, Freddie, thanks so much for your question via YouTube. Here's an interesting email from John, who says, why do most Protestants not know history and the differences between Calvinism versus the Catholic Church? Also, how should I reply to this quote sent to me from my old Baptist friend? The quote is from Timothy Keller, who said, it's no more narrow to claim that one religion is the right one than to claim that your one way to think about all religions is the right one. You ever heard of that quote before?
Yeah, sure. Okay, thanks. So, first of all, why don't more Protestants know about Christian history? Why don't more Catholics know about Christian history? Right? I mean, historical ignorance is not unique to Protestants.
No.
It is endemic to human life.
Legion.
Right? Yeah. And, my background is in history, and the history of the Reformation in particular. And when I lecture on the Reformation, my experience is that Catholics are as ignorant about it as Protestants are.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, everybody's ignorant of something. I'm pretty bad in natural science. I stopped at the end of high school and never had. I think I took what we called rocks for jocks when I was in college. I took Geology 101 to satisfy my lab requirement, and that was it for me in natural science. So there's huge swaths of human endeavor of which I know very little, right? My knowledge of Chinese history is pretty pathetic,
Okay.
So
All right.
that's just the human condition.
Sure.
Now, what do I think about Tim Keller's statement that to say that there's only one religion, a valid religion, is no more narrow than to say that your point of view is narrow? Well, I really think that Keller is missing the point, right? Obviously, everybody thinks that their point of view is the correct one. But you can hold your point of view with greater or lesser dogmatism. So, I'm attached to, say, my theological preferences or my musical preferences or my political preferences. But the question is, how open am I to correction? If somebody brings information to me that contradicts some deeply held belief, am I docile to evidence? Right? Am I teachable? Can I change my mind in the point of contrary point of view, or do I double down and just dig into my confirmation bias? Right? And I think really that's the sign of an open-minded and prudent person. Their ability to be corrected when they're contradicted. Now, religious bigotry, and if that's what we have under discussion here, would take the form of my religious point of view is right, and I'm not open to any arguments to the contrary. And I don't think Catholics ought to be religious bigots in that sense. I mean, it's okay. We should, as Catholics, be thoroughly committed to the teaching of the Church and the dogmas of the Church. But we should also be sensitive to what we can learn about other traditions, other points of view, and at times allow those to influence the way we interpret and live our Catholic faith. Not to say that we're going to throw away our Catholic faith. We're not going to. We're going to defend it. But we're not going to do it in a fundamentalist, narrow-minded, and bigoted way. We're going to be open to different points of view. So, here's a classic example of Catholic open-mindedness. In the Age of Exploration, when Catholic conquistadors were enslaving native populations in the Americas, the question had not occurred before to people, is this an okay thing to do? And there were Catholic theologians like Francisco de Vitoria who said, we've got St. Thomas's teaching on the natural law and the dignity of the human person. We can look at this new intellectual challenge, the existence of indigenous peoples who are not Christians. We can think creatively about that. We can allow their humanity to influence the way we do our theology, and we can think up a new theology called the Theology of Human Rights. Something new can be born, can develop out of the bedrock of the Catholic patrimony in response to new circumstances, rather than just doubling down and saying the way we've always done it has to be the right way and there is no other way.
Yeah. John, thanks so much for your email. Our producer just tells us that the author of that quote is now a recently deceased
I know that.
pastor.
I've heard that news,
and he's referred to as a neo-Calvinist. What would a neo-Calvinist be anyway? Too complicated?
Yeah, I can't go into it in the next 30 seconds.
Not while the music's playing. We'll talk about it another time. Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thanks, Tom.
We do this program right here on EWTN Radio Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Pacific. On behalf of our great team here, including our producer Charles, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. See you tomorrow here on the Wednesday edition of Call to Communion. Have a great day and God bless.
Tomorrow morning on the Sunrise Morning Show,
we will be celebrating the feast of Our Lady Help of Christians and the Church Father, St. Vincent of Lerins. Charlene Katra from the National Catholic Partnership on Disabilities will talk about special considerations in preparing children with autism for confirmation. Plus, Father Augustine Weta will offer more advice on making good decisions with another monk story.